Welcome back to Telltale, guys. I'm Emily,
I'm Greg.
and today we are going to be talking about Death in a Prairie House by William R. Drennan. And this is a true crime, so my true crime girlies, step right up. So this is actually really relevant to Telltale for a couple of reasons. One, this entire book takes place pretty much in Wisconsin.
Okay.
Um, and two, it is about Frank Lloyd Wright. And since we are both very big into design, including architectural design, Frank Lloyd Wright was considered a genius for his time when it comes to architecture. So this book kind of takes you through the quick early life and his early married life into his affair and then into the murders that actually happened at his Taliesin home.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a really interesting true crime story. One, because it has such a big, just a big famous person surrounding
Yeah.
him. And he was a big deal in his time, not
Mm-hmm.
just because of his talent as an architect, but the controversy surrounding his personal philosophies and views.
Well, and the fact that he was an asshole.
He was a complete asshole. This
Complete
guy's a
narcissist.
dick. Awful. He's an awful human. So
Yeah.
he had a very controversial life because he just made a lot of crazy choices. The first being that he got married to a lovely young lady and had three children, and then one day just decided, I'm done. I'm out. With also having, of course, under his belt affairs with multiple wives of his clients, and sometimes just clients if they were women who were single or spinsters. So he was definitely a little bit of a ladies' man, which is weird because he was such a dick. But
Yeah. Well,
he cheated on
how
his
much of
wife.
a dick he was. He left his entire family in the United States and went to Italy.
Yeah, to have
Just left
affairs.
his whole family and kids high and dry.
Yeah,
Left his wife, went to Italy.
and to Japan too at one point.
Yeah.
So like he just traveled and had affairs with other women in these places all the time, and then he kind of settled for one.
Mm-hmm.
What was her name? Mima?
Something like that.
Mima? Mima?
An odd name.
Yeah, it was a really odd name.
But yeah,
She
when he came
was.
back to the States and founded Taliesin at Spring Green, Wisconsin,
Mhm.
that's when he married her and they
Yeah. And well, they
lived
weren't
like
even married. They were
no,
just
right at
yeah,
first.
because no, they never got married.
Oh, they didn't? I thought they
No,
did.
they never got married
Okay,
because his first wife would not divorce him
that's right.
legally.
Yeah.
And so they just lived and cohabitated together as like a common law marriage sort of thing, or a marriage in philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
not an official marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And like he just had this really weird relationship with everybody, his sons, his ex-wife, or his wife who was his estranged wife, I guess is a better way of saying it.
Mm-hmm.
But one day he travels to Chicago to work on a building that, of course, no longer exists. It was one of those big deal kind of, I believe it was a resort.
Midway Gardens.
Yes, the
Yeah.
Midway Gardens Resort. He's working
Midway
on that.
Gardens, which was a popular entertainment spot on south side of Chicago, which
Mhm.
was torn down to build, of all things, Cabrini Green, which was
Yes,
then torn down because that was one of the worst architectural and social mistakes in American
yeah,
history.
absolutely. But Frank Lloyd Wright, he and Mima have been, or Mama, however you say her name, were together for a while. And he had left for Chicago to take care of things. Mima and her two children were visiting from her marriage. And he had a draftsman and a carpenter and another gentleman who were working on the property, a landscaper, I think, working on the property, along with his butler and his cook. They were the only ones at the house. Butler just loses his freaking mind, grabs a hatchet, and starts hacking people apart.
And sets fire.
And sets fire to the building. Yes. This
First of
was
three fires, I believe, that
yes,
Taliesin,
Taliesin just kept burning down. Like it just kept going.
and more recently was crushed by the oak tree falling.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
That house is
It's seen a lot of shit. Poor thing.
it's what do you call that? It's got bad luck.
Yeah, it's got some bad juju over there. But yeah, the butler just goes insane. He starts hacking up people. His wife, who was also the cook, sees him hacking up people and hightails. She jumps out a window and hightails it to the road and just keeps running and running and running and running. She did eventually later get found in a ditch, basically exhausted and hiding and scared, and was picked up by the police and then kind of just disappeared into life, never to be heard of again. The butler hacks as many people apart as he can, though some escaped trying to get out because he eventually locked the workmen into a space while they were having lunch and started the building on fire.
Mm-hmm.
So he started with Mima and the children, hacked them apart. The little girl didn't die right away, the other two did, and they burned in the fire, to a crisp. And then the little girl was able to get out of the building but ended up collapsing in the courtyard with her clothes burned off and just hacked in the brain. Most of the gentlemen who were there, besides the butler, ended up dying later from injuries or burns caused by the situation. The butler himself tried to hide and took cyanide. He ended up dying later in police custody as they were doing inquisitions with him. And nobody knows why this butler did this, other than he just snapped and decided, and he never
And
feels it either.
and it's hard to figure out why something like this would happen in Wisconsin. Things like that don't happen here.
No, especially not in little Nowheresville, Wisconsin.
I'm
Um,
being funny.
right? Well,
Ed Gein,
well,
Jeffrey
this is
Dahmer.
just a weird murder. This isn't like a serial killer. I mean, he
Well, he
got like
killed
seven
enough. Yeah,
people,
it
but
counts.
all in one go. But it for the town, this was actually extremely jarring. They already had the stain of Frank Lloyd Wright and his mistress living in town.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody hated him because he was an asshole. And also they just didn't like his morality. He was a huge individualist. Um and like Ayn Rand even it had one of her books inspired by
Yeah,
him as
wasn't
a
that the
character.
Fountainhead?
The Fountainhead,
Yeah.
yes. And he was just he fully believed that he had to do everything to his own whims. And that because he was an individualist, if he did anything against his whims, he was sinning against himself. And so basically, he felt like he was the god of his own universe. And in fact, in many cases, had called himself god of his own universe, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Probably didn't feel like that after the Taliesin murders.
Yeah.
Um, but he definitely, though it was never confirmed why the butler snapped, Frank Lloyd Wright as a person and the type of atmosphere he built into his home and his personal philosophies, and also his inability to pay people in a timely manner, if at all, were all huge character flaws that he had, that could
Yeah.
have contributed to the stress the butler was under that caused him to just lose his mind.
It did affect him though, because this was right after he came back from Italy, pretty much,
Mm-hmm.
and he was still doing his Prairie style. And around that time, he kind of stopped working.
Yeah.
And when he came back with a completely different style, which
Yes.
is reflected in the Johnson Wax administration building,
Yes. He
a lot
went.
more streamlined 1930s, not his traditional Prairie style.
Yes. In fact, the book mentions that towards the end, where he went from building these open, airy, natural spaces with a hearth at the center of the home to kind of represent the core heart of family in the home,
Mm-hmm.
to building things that are more fortress-like,
Mm-hmm.
lot smaller windows, lot more wall space, a lot more stark, less airy.
More rounded corners.
Yes, more rounded corners, more structural and more utilitarian
Mm-hmm.
than beautiful spaces like he
Mm-hmm.
used to do. So yes, he was very emotionally affected by this, and then he also was very emotionally affected by his children's responses and his mistress's husband's response, because they were still all married.
Mm.
And like this guy lost his two children and his estranged wife in this incident. And on top of that, had to deal with Frank Lloyd Wright,
Yeah.
who was a dick.
Yeah.
So it was just a horrific situation. surrounding a man who was extremely unwell and misunderstood, um, and a butler who was. There was a lot too. It was very racially charged at the time
Mm,
because the butler was black, but there's very little history at all on this couple that Frank Lloyd Wright had hired to be his cook and his butler too,
mhm.
which is also really unusual. They were just recommended by friends. There is also suspect that nobody actually kept their original names, like their names had changed before they started
Mhm.
working as home service people.
Okay.
So it's just really a crazy situation, super
Mhm.
interesting. So like there's a lot of documentaries about this. Anything you read about the history of Frank Lloyd Wright brings this up, but this book in particular really does focus mostly on the situation and its aftermath.
Yeah.
Very pretty much early married life and early career onward is where this book kind of takes you. So it's a great true crime read, really interesting piece of American history, especially surrounding such a prolific architect who has stuff all over the Midwest and East Coast, even
Mhm.
in California, I think.
Got
And
one here in Two Rivers.
yeah, we have one here in Two Rivers, and we have one, I think there's one over in Manitowoc as well. I can't remember.
No, nothing in Manitowoc.
But anyway, he definitely has a interesting life philosophy and history that is just drama after drama. So if you are a true crime lover, this is definitely a book for you,
Or
especially
just interested in Frank Lloyd Wright.
yeah, or you're interested in Frank Lloyd Wright. This is really an interesting read, and I'm sure there's probably others that also cover this subject, but this one was really nice and concise. It was great, easy to read language. There wasn't any legalese in it that some things
Mhm.
do, and it was a really quick read. It's not a very large
Yeah, it
book,
doesn't look very long.
and quite honestly, I keep seeing these in thrift stores
Oh.
of this particular copy, and it's actually a really great read. But I think
Mhm.
a lot of people buy books to read them because they're popular, and then when they're done with them and they want new books on their shelf, they just clear them out.
Yeah.
But so this is an easy one to access from anywhere, including thrift stores probably in your local area.
Hmm.
So it's really accessible. Just really well done. So
Hmm.
I enjoyed it.
I haven't read that book, but I've always been interested in that because I've always been interested in Wright because I grew up in Racine, not close to any of Wright's buildings, but where I did grow up at that time, things were just right with trees and such that I could see the tower from my parents'
Ah,
house.
yep.
And I did go for bike rides and I did often ride past the Johnson
Mhm,
building and the Hardy house and out to Wind Point where the Johnson wing spread
mhm,
is. And there was another one I didn't even realize it's kind of hidden back off the beaten path.
mhm.
It was owned by one of the Johnson children until just recently it went up for sale.
Interesting.
And that's in and out of the way spot. That's one of his newer homes, one of his last homes.
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright around her scene. And so
Yeah.
I was constantly around that growing up.
Mhm.
And it influenced a lot of my growth as an artist and a designer.
Mhm. And quite honestly, too, my exposure to Frank Lloyd Wright was actually my aunt bought a Frank Lloyd Wright home in Michigan.
Hmm.
And still owns it to this day. I
Hmm.
didn't even know who Frank Lloyd Wright was until that happened, and she just happens to have a lot of copybooks that her home is mentioned in, and other places. So I happened to kind of do my own self research to figure out who he was as a person, and then over time, I just started kind of every time I saw a documentary or something about him, I'd read about it or whatever, and so I started kind of picking up these books just to kind of see um, more about his life because I didn't really
Yeah.
have a lot of context. I knew a lot about his work because of the coffee table books, but I didn't know a lot about his biography as a person.
Okay.
And so this really caught my eye, having heard rumor of the Taliesin murders, but not actually knowing details. So this was my first exposure to the actual full police report and details
Hmm.
of what happened here. So
Hmm.
really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Really fucked up
I've just
life.
been to Taliesin, and when you
Mm-hmm.
take the tour, they tell you about that. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't been there.
that's about the extent of
It's
my
on my
knowledge.
bucket list. I've driven past it. I've seen it. I just haven't gone into it. So,
I've been there. I've been to Taliesin West.
very
Very
cool.
cool. and the Arizona Biltmore is a cool
Ooh,
hotel.
nice.
And I've been down to Springfield twice to the Dana Thomas house down
Mhm.
there. And
Yep.
of course, I've toured all the places in Racine.
Yeah. There's a house that I saw that's close to U of I in Chicagoland area. Really
Lots of
love.
them down there.
Yeah, lots of great Frank Lloyd Wright houses in Chicagoland area.
I've
So.
always wanted to go down to Oak Park, is it?
Mm-hmm.
That's where he had his studio and he built a lot of his early homes down there.
Mm-hmm.
I've always wanted to go on their tour and see
Yeah,
some of those.
that would be super fun. We'll have to do
And
that sometime.
Falling Water.
Yeah.
I've had, I've been looking for somebody to go with me to Falling Water sometime and see.
Oh,
Okay.
I'll go
It's
gladly.
got to be like a week
Yeah.
because I'm not flying,
No,
driving.
that's fine.
Take probably a day and a half to get there.
Yeah, I don't think that'd be a problem. I would
Day and
enjoy
a
that.
half. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Telltale's going on a field trip. Yeah. So that's really all I have to say about this book. It was a really interesting read if you like true crime, and it's relevant to us because he was a Midwesterner. Like
Mhm.
he was born and raised in the Midwest and continued his life here and did a lot of work here. So he's pretty prolific despite what a jerk he was.
Yeah.
Crazy man.
Yeah. It's one of those cases where he was totally egotistical,
Mm-hmm.
which I hate.
Yeah,
But on
he's
the
a
other
genius.
hand, he was such a genius that you have to ask, maybe it was kind of deserved
Yeah,
to stand above everybody
yeah.
because he was better than the rest of us, at
His
least at
his
architecture.
family, like it gets kind of into that. His family made a big deal of him. He was his mother's favorite out of all her children, and
Okay.
she made a big deal of him. So he was kind of nurtured to be very egotistical and to be a big deal. And so he just embodied it. But yeah, what can you do?
And I apologize. I think one of my books is throwing a glare on the camera lens, and so you're all ethereal and it's cloud.
I am goddess. Step aside, Frank Lloyd Wright. Here I am to be the new goddess. Anyway,
So I apologize if this turns out to be kind
yeah,
of
it
a
might
little
be
bit.
the sun too. I think the sun's kind of coming
Well,
through
yeah, it's
the
coming down,
window.
hitting that Harlan Ellison,
Oh.
reflecting up by the lens.
Right up there. Oh well, we'll get over it. But yeah, so that's all I have to say about this book. It's a great read. I definitely recommend Death in a Prairie House. I won't call it a top tale because I'm probably
Okay.
sure it was good, but it didn't blow me away per
Okay.
se in the storytelling. And what can blow you away, honestly, when it comes to storytelling about real life things,
Well, I
other than
mean,
it's
there are
shocking.
classics like In Cold Blood, which
Mm-hmm.
we've never read, and we should put that on our
With
list.
Truman Capote.
Yeah,
Love.
that's considered to be the first true crime
Mm-hmm.
novel,
Yep.
and that is considered to be a great classic.
Mm-hmm. And we
Modern
have read
classic.
too, like Devil in the White City
Yeah.
and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
So, I mean,
So I think they can be.
mm-hmm,
It's just, the writing, the research, the specific event,
mm-hmm,
all those have to come together to create something that people are going to be more engaged with.
mm-hmm.
It's easier to write a classic fiction
Yeah,
than it is to write a classic nonfiction
yeah. And quite honestly,
story.
too, like his life is just so dramatic. It writes itself.
Hmm.
It is compelling because the guy just kept having crazy shit happen in his life
Yeah.
that was you most of the time his own doing.
Hmm.
So it's really easy to write a story about someone who is that interesting and that dramatic.
Yeah.
But I don't feel like this added anything to it other than giving you what was known history and some opinion and speculation about it.
Yeah.
So I didn't feel like it was that big of a deal. Like it wasn't like Devil in the White City that gives you really interesting
And gives
storytelling.
you a unique perspective. It isn't
Yeah.
just talking about the one thing, it's showing how these two things
Yes.
intersected.
Yes. How
Very
all of the life circumstances surrounding this area in Chicago and stuff. Like,
Hmm.
and you kind of get a little bit of that in here, but I felt like I wanted more of that.
Okay.
So, yeah, it was a good one.
Okay.
That's all I gotta say.
All right. And I didn't read it, so I just know a bit about Frank Lloyd Wright. That's all.
Mhm. Yeah, this was my going off on my own pleasure reading sort of
Mhm.
book. So
Which you can do from time to time.
yeah,
So I do. God knows I do enough of that myself.
yeah. I decided December was my true crime, so that's when I read it. I actually read two true crimes, and maybe I'll do the other one, but
Okay.
we'll see. So
Okay.
thanks
Two
for
good
joining
ones.
us. Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. Like and subscribe. Tell us what you think of Frank Lloyd Wright if you know anything about him or anything about the Taliesin murders, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye!